To everybody online and to our panelists, good afternoon, good morning, good evening for those, gunners who are logging in from all over the world. Thank you for joining the Defense Industry Initiative and GW Law for this webinar on post-government employment issues. I'm Sarah Needham. I'm a DII fellow and visiting associate professor at GW Law. So before we begin, as usual, just a couple administrative items. We do have everybody muted, and we'd ask that you stay muted throughout the webinar, but we have a chat feature for questions and answers towards the end. So hopefully we have a couple minutes for that. And I also wanted to mention this webinar is really going to be focusing on some practical tips and strategies, best practices in this space. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going over, overview of the law or any of the regulations really. So for some of our students maybe that are logging in, you just got to try to keep up because we're going to do a lot of practical tips here in this webinar. For those not aware of DII, it is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization comprised of around 80 defense and aerospace contractors. It was formed in 1986 as a result of President Reagan's Packard Commission. And really, that the result of that commission was to urge defense contractors have greater self-governance, and DII was born. Our mission is to promote and advance a culture of ethical conduct across defense contractors and amongst the entire industry. We do quarterly webinars. We have a lot of featured tools. So if you're interested in becoming a member, it's dii.org, or you can reach out to me anytime. So thank you to DII. And the other half of this, GW Law needs no introduction, the preeminent, wonderful GW Law and the government procurement program really leading in this space. So thank you so much to GW as well. And we'll get in now to kind of an overview of our program. For this webinar, first we have setting the stage. So we're going to start kind of with an overview of why should business leaders care about this, kind of where organizations may be getting tripped up, and how do you build that ethical culture. After that, we'll move into gray areas and common pitfalls. So these are going to be the messy situations. Maybe records are incomplete, and what do companies do to kind of minimize the risk in that area? And maybe there's some fact patterns that don't fit neatly into whatever kind of program you actually have or your post-government employment checklist. So what are some of those risky areas? And finally, we'll talk about building strong compliance programs, what it takes to actually manage one and run it day to day, what kind of metrics you might be looking at, and what companies should expect, enforcement trends moving into the future. So that's a look at kind of the three buckets that we'll move on today. And now I'd like to welcome our speakers, our four wonderful speakers. Thank you so much again for being here. And we're lucky to have a range of expertise online this morning. We have in-house counsel, outside counsel, and academia represented. And I'll ask each of them to introduce themselves. And if we could, please, Jessica, start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to DII for co-hosting this with GW Law School. It's an important program. I'm Jessica Tiltman. I'm the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law at GW Law School, where not only do I teach our school's foundational government procurement law course, but my specialty starting in January in the spring semester every year is the anti-corruption and compliance course that focuses on compliance issues in government procurement. Thanks.
If you don't mind.
Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Yar Pak. I'm currently Senior Counselor for Labor and Employment Law for Mission Technologies, which is one of the divisions of HII. And in that role, I support all of the HR functions across Mission Technologies, including we'll talk about this a little bit more, but I do review the revolving door issues that may pop up as we go through the recruiting process. Been in private practice for a very long time. I am a GW Law grad from a very long time ago. Never took any of the government procurement classes, though, I have to say. I was more focused on labor and employment while I was at GW, but I know it's a top-notch school. I'm happy to be here. By the way, can you see my video? Is it on?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm getting a message over Zoom saying my video has been turned off, but all right, I'll be quiet for now.
All right, Tanya.
Hi, my name is Tanya Coles, and I am a senior corporate counsel at Microsoft. I am our U.S. public sector compliance lead, and I've been here for about 3.5 years, and I head up our federal and state and local compliance program, and part of that is our post-government employment process.
Awesome. Thank you. And Amy?
My name is Amy Hong. I am a partner and co-chair of the government contracts practice at Seyfarth Shaw. I have been in private practice as a government contracts practitioner for my entire legal career. And I have a focus on government contracts compliance counseling, and also a large majority of my practice is representing companies in pursuing or defending bid protests.
Awesome. And I know we'll touch on bid protests because it's kind of that what happens if we don't part of compliance. So I'm sure we'll get there. All right. So kind of jumping into our first bucket, understanding the restrictions and implications right away. Amy, I will start with you. Why should senior business leaders care about post-government employment? Maybe it's not the first thing that catches their eye, but why should they care? Why does it matter?
Yeah, Sarah, you said we'd get to bid protests, and now we're here. It didn't take long. So I think for this, and obviously from my perspective as a bid protest attorney, kind of one of the nice things about post government employment ethics issues is you can show senior business leaders very concrete, real ramifications for getting these issues wrong or making the wrong call. And it's not oh, is somebody going to find out about it in 5 years, and are we going to have to make a mandatory disclosure? Or is this kind of, if there's some sort of esoteric compliance issue that's going to happen down the line, where I see these issues come up is very concretely in maybe you hired somebody, and as a result of that person's knowledge or because of what they were working on in the government, you are precluded from using that person in preparing a particular proposal for a particular procurement, or worse, you did use that person and now you are excluded from that competition. So to me, I think there are very just concrete examples and very quick repercussions for getting these issues wrong. And so it's an easier sell to, I think, senior business leaders than some other areas where it might take years for a problem to even unfold.
Makes sense. And Tanya, in your experience, it's kind of related. Have you seen managers kind of adopt this proactive approach and kind of understand that right away? Or how do you kind of build that culture where you're seen as not a late stage gatekeeper, but more of a, hey, let me get involved from the front end, prevent all this from happening?
Yeah, I think from our end, our goal is to provide education and training on this to let people know, hey, this is what it's about. This is why you should be concerned about it. I think the biggest problems do occur in the proposal venue when it comes to hires. And so I think it's more of making sure that those people who are working on those proposal teams are aware of these restrictions and don't accidentally, bring in a consultant that you don't know about, or because those might fall through the cracks, right? Consultants don't go through your hiring process. So that, could be a problem. And so I think it's a lot about training and reminding people consistently.
Oh, I think you might be on mute. Yep.
Sorry for technical difficulties. I think when you talk about building a culture to make sure that the hiring manager is aware, I 100% agree with Tanya about education and training and pushing that down. But we also have to get the highest levels of the leadership involved in passing on that message and reinforcing it. So, when we talk about ethics and compliance in this space, we make sure it's issued by a compliance director, maybe even the president or CEO of a company, just to stress how important it is to get it right at the start. Because like Tanya said, you don't want to, and I think Amy's thought is you don't want to get caught off guard to say, oh, what's this person doing here when you've gone through the process. There's no way to undo some of the mistakes that might be made in this kind of environment. So.
It reminds me of when I took Jessica's class, that tone at the top. So look, it's sinking in. I remember, X number of years later, I remember that point that you were just brought up. So, okay. So Jessica, I will ask you kind of a follow-up to that, which is, Amy mentioned these we can say bid protests and people are like, oh, that's a problem. That makes sense. But what are some of these like more minor interactions, something like an informational meeting or, hey, can you just take a look at my resume? What do you think? Like that might trigger a post-government employment restriction. And where do you draw that line if your experience?
So, first, thank you for the shout out for remembering that from class. That always makes a professor feel good. But second, what I find fascinating about this area, and so when I've done this training a few times with like NCMA and some other organizations, DoD through DAU, and I always have the title from, although they made me change it this year, from protest to prison. And the reason I like to use that title, it gets your attention. But what I often find is that the people that attend those trainings are generally want to comply with the law and they mean well. And the vast majority of people, except when there's like bad intent and there's recruitment for specifically and something that's going to undermine competition or among other things. I think the vast majority of people just want to understand their compliance obligations. The challenge I think you have with post-employment, unlike, you know, gifts or gratuities or bribery or what I call these kind of other buckets of compliance challenges is that it just feels so normal to want to have these meetings. And it's something that outside of the government context would just be a normal meeting or informational meeting, or maybe someone who's moved on to the private sector has reached back to people that are now looking to leave or were looking to leave in the last 6 months. And and that can just feel like a normal friendly exchange. And so that's the challenge, is that stuff that feels like our day to day stuff can actually trigger some of these restrictions. And the most important thing is to remember that you've got to distinguish between the conflict of interest of rules that come into play before you leave government and then the post-employment rules that come into play after you've left government. And it gets a little tied up because the Procurement Integrity Act obviously is going to like bridge the two, right? So you've got like multiple rule regimes all operating at the same time at different levels, ethics restrictions, criminal restrictions, FAR reminders that can lead to protests. And so the compliance obligations are one thing, but I think in terms of if you've already left government versus before you're leaving government, and maybe we can just take some moment to distinguish between the two different obligations. But if you've already left government, these are your old colleagues, right? And so now you've got people thinking, oh, I'm just going to go back, or I'm going to go to a Christmas party, or I'm going to have this interaction. And that very quickly, what can start off as a normal, legal, appropriate conversation can get ugly quickly. And that's the biggest risk.
Absolutely. And then at some point, someone calls Amy, right? And I would assume that she's seen, has a bunch of stories kind of going through her head, though. Um, yeah, and it sounds like one of the risks that Jessica's kind of talking about too is that procurement sensitive information. So it could be kind of that exchange. You meant the Procurement Integrity Act. It's kind of like, what are you talking about? It's not just the meeting itself, but what's the kind of the content of it. So, Amy, I'll ask you, what's kind of your approach to screening for procurement sensitive involvement when the government records might be unclear or incomplete? And specifically, if you can kind of touch on these agency ethics letters that probably most of us are familiar with.
Yeah, I think in 2025 and 2026, probably more than in any other time, it's important to remember that ethics letters are important, but particularly from a bid protest standpoint, they are not going to be the word of God. Ethics letters, you have ethics officials who are, potentially overworked right now, stretched very thin. I run into this situation a lot where a company says, well, we so and so gave us an ethics letter and it didn't talk about this restriction, or so therefore we thought it was okay that he or she was doing X, Y, or Z. And what I always tell people is, from a bid protest perspective, GAO is going to give, they'll acknowledge an ethics letter, and they'll talk about its existence, but GAO is going to look at the facts of what is the procurement and what access did this information, what information did this individual have access to, and then could that information have been competitively useful on this procurement. And the fact that you have an ethics letter that might give a different take is not going to be the be all end all. And I think one thing to keep in mind is for ethics letters, to put it candidly, you can get garbage in, garbage out. And you might have somebody who is just trying to be transparent, but at the same time has a vested interest in being able to work on certain things post government, because that is what makes them a valuable employee. So you have somebody who themselves almost has a conflict of interest in accurately and transparently disclosing all of the things they worked on in the government, everything that they had access to, and every way that might give somebody a competitive advantage on the outside. So if you have an ethics letter that simply does not address the information or the specific procurement in question, because that person never disclosed it, or only gave a kind of limited briefing of what he or she actually had access to, or maybe focused more on information they actually looked at as opposed to information they had access to, that ethics letter is not going to, it's going to carry some weight, but it's not going to, it's going to be able to be rebutted, I guess is the best way to put it.
Not the get out of jail free card. Yeah.
Exactly.
What I've found in the many ethics letters that I have received is that they're very boilerplate. They pretty much say, we've told the major whoever, whoever, that they need to reveal all of what they've done, but it's not in the letter, right? And so now it's a situation where you have a letter that's telling me what the rules are. I know the rules. I didn't need you to restate that, right? I need to know what this person did. And so then it really comes back to an analysis that comes back and tells the potential candidate, soon to be employee, when you're working on stuff, you need to raise the flag if you start going into waters where it's something you've encountered, and that puts a lot on that employee. And just as Amy said, there's a bit of a conflict of interest there, right? You're coming from a job and this is your wheelhouse. You're trying to get a job outside the government that you know how to do, right? And then suddenly it's the same thing. And it causes a problem for your new employer. And so that's like a really gray area that has to be, dealt with.
I love that comment about garbage in, garbage out that Amy made. And Tanya, I agree with you. Some of these ethics letters are boilerplate, and the only differentiation may be the first paragraph that says, here's a summary of what you've told me about what you've been doing. Then there's a one sentence conclusion after going through 2 pages of what the law is. We're not particularly interested in what the law is. I mean, we know what the law is, but you don't have to tell us that and spend so much time. I'm sure they don't spend a lot of time, but we've had a couple of situations where we've had ethics letters, and we believe that incorrect information or information was misunderstood regarding a particular candidate situation. So we've pushed back a little bit on ethics letters, and it wasn't through us, but that particular candidate had retained private counsel and tried to push back on the ethics letter, say, here's what I was actually doing. I think you misunderstood what I was doing. And that particular ethics attorney was not receptive of any efforts to try to correct the record. So we ended up with a situation where the candidate got outside counsel. We had to retain outside counsel to try to resolve the situation. And when you get to that point where you have multiple lawyers looking at this thing, it's just not going to be a good outcome. So, but yeah.
Well, and I think also in this time, where Amy was talking about resources being thin, we also are getting situations where candidates are saying they can't get an ethics letter, right? And, their time in the government was well removed. That's not realistic that they're going to get an ethics letter, but they maybe still have restrictions. And so we've started requiring in those situations a self-attestation, where pretty much I have the whole list of where did you work, what did you do, like my list of wonderful questions. And they have to write an attestation that pretty much outlines their restrictions. And in some ways, it's better than the ethics letter in that it actually has information that's useful to us. And it puts the onus on the candidate to actually, you're attesting to what you've done and haven't done, whereas the letter is something else somebody wrote based on who knows what information.
Can I just say how wonderful it is that you do that? I mean, I'm sure your candidates don't like it. Right, it's more things you have to fill out. I'm sure nobody likes to do more paperwork. But I mean, to me, this is just one of the examples of how sophisticated compliance programs and companies can adapt to these situations where, look, you've got an overtaxed ethics system, and put aside yours example of disagreeing with the ethics opinion, you know, this is a challenging time. I can't even imagine what it's been like for ethics professionals with the flood of people that have been leaving the government over the past year or getting ready to leave the government. And so my sympathy goes out to them, because it's not an easy task to do it. And I think that's why you're seeing even more boilerplate than I think you would have seen in prior years. And if boilerplate's all you're giving as an ethics professional outside of this context, then that's just not, to me, an appropriate use of your discretion and a great use of your job duties. But I think it's a great way to show like the innovation on the side of the companies that have invested in compliance and that have invested in these efforts to really say, like, look, we're not going to get what we need from the government, but here, even because I think about the civilian side where you might not be getting that anyway. And so I think that's a great practice for it. I have bigger thoughts on like the overall value of some of these things in terms of what the government's trying to achieve with it. But I think Sarah's going to reserve some time for me, hopefully, to give my thoughts on the whole
I
point
have
of it
Jessica
anyway.
reserve time. Yep, I have an entire block for for rants. Yep, I got it at the end. So, but I know both Tanya and Jessica were just talking about, we want to hire these people, the flood of government coming in. So Tanya and Yura, I would like to ask, we're talking about some pretty senior people, right? I think we all like very, very senior government officials. So how have you kind of advised, your business leaders that like business imperative to hire these people? We really want X person. This, like, they were very high up at this, agency, and we're very interested in hiring them, but they're more risky, right? It's not just the, program manager maybe that worked on a couple of procurements, and, so these really high level riskier people, how do you kind of balance that imperative with, the higher risks?
Yeah, I think one of the things we found, and it was maybe over a year ago, a year plus, you read announcements that people have been hired into the company. You're like, oh, wow, I didn't see their ethics letter, And so then I was trying like, what happened? How did I not see that? Right. And so then I found out that, sometimes these hired people don't go through the regular recruiting process that the rest of us go through. Right. And so, there's a whole different group. There was a whole different group of executive recruiters. And so, I had to, kind of shift over and start the process again with that group. Like, this is the importance, and I get it. There's lots of sensitivity around executive recruiting, a lot of hush hush, a lot of this, that, and the other, but the ramifications can be so much larger. And so I think it's really having that group get on board and understand the process, and sometimes have a really in-depth analysis completed for their candidate, prospective employee on, what do you plan on having them do and where are the guardrails going to be? And so that's really what we've done. Is it as mature as I want it to be? We haven't gotten there yet, but it's getting there, but I think everybody, the level of maturity in this shifts over time. You're on mute.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And of course, because I'm in someone else's office, I can't figure out how to move the mouse. But we don't have, as far as I'm aware, we don't have a separate recruiting line for executives. But I can totally see where that kind of, going through the back channels, or here's a buddy of mine that I was just talking to. He's looking to transition out of the military or out of the agency, blah, 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 right? But what we've done really is just kind of embed the whole revolving door process into the recruiting process. So it's kind of like some of those threshold forms that a candidate might fill out. So even before they go through, they get processed for interviews or selected for interviews, we try to address those revolving door questions and any kind of post-government restrictions that may apply. So that way, it's embedded into part of the recruiting process. And, I just think again, we when our recruiters work with the hiring managers, they know this is going to be a threshold issue that we need to address as we're going through the process. And so far, it's been working, but like Tanya mentioned, if there are backdoor channels that are being worked, it's not going to get caught, right? So
I do have a question for you with your program with regard to how soon in the process you do a lot of your analysis. Sometimes, if they're down to 2 or 3 candidates, they don't want us to do the review. They want us to do the review on the person that they're making the offer to. When you said you move it up in your process, do you have issues with that?
no, for the most part, I think when, in terms of the timeline, they'll send me a candidate they're very interested in. They have an idea of who that selected candidate may be as they're going through the process. But no offers will ever be made without going through the revolving door review, because we don't want to know about it after an offer's been made. Like I said at the beginning, sometimes it's kind of hard to undo stuff as you move along with the process. So when I work with the recruiters and they flag the issue for me and send me a candidate for review, try to turn those around as quickly as possible. So, because they're always saying, "Oh, this is urgent. We want to get to the next step with this candidate, so we don't lose this candidate." So, a lot of the time pressure is just on keeping the process moving.
All right, good. And Jessica, I wanted to ask you, so we've talked a lot about these processes that work, right, at the companies that are as they're moving, but we also talked a lot about things are kind of changing. 2025 was a crazy year. So given this like influx of these well-connected senior officials, where do you expect kind of enforcement and oversight efforts to be moving in the future that we could be looking out for?
Oh, crystal ball. I was actually sitting there this morning thinking about 2025 and year in review and like what messages would I take away when I think about like our field in the face of like everything that's happened. And I think the destruction of part of the White House is an apt metaphor for some of the impacts we've seen this year in the field. But it's hard to know. Enforcement to me is a really weird thing right now. I think that we should not assume that protest activity isn't there. So again, if you're not afraid of criminal enforcement and you're not afraid of, you know, other compliance aspects, just don't forget that the statute of limitations on things. But B, in terms of like genuine risks, I think the one that's most present, and I think that's one that's already been discussed, is the protest risk. If you're not taking steps as a company to reduce your risk under, FAR Part 3. And remember, most people are going to be looking at this as an OCI issue. And even though the evaluation framework is similar, these are conflicts under 3. These are not waivable. So you can come to the GAO, or you can go to Court of Federal Claims with the fanciest mitigation plan, and maybe that helps it, right? Maybe that helps, but the agency's not going to be able to wave this thing away if you haven't taken steps to deal with it appropriately. And so I have some charts that I've made, and we have them publicly available that kind of side by side compare and contrast the different rules that apply to these scenarios. So I think if anything, you should be aware that the protest risk is always going to be there, and so and I think people have started popping their heads back up to protest more readily these days than they were, I think, in the early part of the year. But enforcement's odd, and I don't know what that looks like. And I don't, when you think about how most of these rules are going to be forced, most of this would be going through, maybe it's a U.S. Attorney's office, maybe it's going to be routed through public integrity section. That doesn't look the same anymore. So given the big amount of like turmoil impacting the Justice Department this year, I don't know how aggressive, but again, you've always got that statute of limitations lingering in the back. So I would just be careful. And the other thing is, I mean, I guess I get back to even then, like whistleblower stuff, the IG's offices have all been impacted. So I wouldn't be I don't say I wouldn't be worried. You should always be prepared for potential enforcement now from the federal government, because you never know when someone's got to see something that they want to address. But the protest risk is always looming. So if anything, prepare for that.
think that's the perfect. I was going to ask Amy. I was like, I wonder if she's biting at it or she knows that I have a question that's something we've discussed. So Amy, we've talked about kind of that thinking where companies are like, when they're faced with some kind of enforcement, they say, they get asked, what have you done? And then what are you going to do, to remediate, or what's your kind of your mitigation plan? So what's your advice here about when issues do arise? What differentiates these inquiries, like Jessica mentioned, IGs, that kind of end quickly and you can just shut it down versus ones that escalate into audits, subpoenas, suspension, debarment conversations? Like, where can kind of companies navigate that de-escalation protocol?
Yeah, and now this is moving away from like the protest context because as Dean Tiltman mentioned, I mean, I don't think GAO doesn't care that you're going to correct the problem in the future, right? They care about that specific instance. But when you're going into kind of the ethical considerations and, are you a responsible contractor and how did you let this happen? When we're looking at that, or from the IG's perspective, I don't look at post government employment issues really any differently than I look at time mischarging or human trafficking violence. I mean, all of it comes down to, like you said, what happened, why did it happen, and why isn't it going to happen again? And so the what happened is just kind of, that is what it is. The why it happened is hopefully where your company has a good story of, look at all of these processes we have in place. We do screen for revolving door issues as part of the recruitment process. And that is, that's part of the policy. We do that every time. And we can't help that this one person on the capture team, passed along a resume that somehow went around the standard process, and that wasn't flagged, or there's just a rogue incident that is not in line with what our standard processes and procedures are. And I think generally speaking, the government understands that those things happen. But the issue is, did you have the policies in place to prevent them, such that this was an isolated incident? And then why isn't it going to happen again? Okay, even if you have all these great policies and procedures, why did this isolated incident happen? And how are you going to improve your processes and procedures moving forward to ensure that that isolated incident doesn't happen again? Or maybe your policies and procedures were not really where they should have been. In question 2, question 3 is really where you can show all of the things that you have fixed moving forward, such that the government doesn't have to be worried that you're going to continue to have these issues in the future.
That all makes sense. And I'm glad that those two questions were kind of back to back, because I think your answers really dovetail together. But what if we get to a point, and I'll ask kind of our in-house folks here, what if we get to the point where you're in the middle of a solicitation, you're like, oh, discovered there's a problem, right? And we don't need to go any specifics about what kind of problem, but what if you're just right in the middle of something and you realize there's an issue? What kind of best practices have you all been doing when that happens?
I've been fortunate enough not to have like a post-government employment situation in that. I have had Procurement Integrity Act situations, so I can see how these could be. What I would do would be the same. We immediately firewalled everybody, right? We made sure, who heard what, who saw what, firewalled everything, and then, immediately had a plan to go to the CO to explain what happened. We, sometimes you have those situations in a procurement where, you're like, well, do we tell the government or not tell the government? I'm the compliance person. I'm like, yeah, you have to tell them this is what happened. You don't want it to come out later that you knew and didn't say anything. That's even worse, right? And so, but it's a hard path to go on, especially if you're in the 11th hour of a procurement that they've spent 3 or 4 months preparing and something happens. And now they're like, what do you mean we may not be considered? These are the situations we're dealing with, right? And so, err on the side of telling what happened, and begging for forgiveness and having a good, plan to remediate and be able to continue on. So, that's what I would do. But I'd like to hear from Yura, maybe. You're on mute again.
maybe I should just not mute myself. But I agree with 100% with what Tanya said. I think that, you need to be ready to act, firewalling off individuals who may have been involved, being transparent in terms of the issues that have arisen. Our compliance team is all about transparency, and I think I have not had a situation where post-government restrictions have been an issue in a proposal or anything like that. But I would think, based on what some of our ethics are and what our protocol has been with other types of issues that have arisen, we like to be transparent and address them up front. You know what they say, the cover up is always worse than the crime, right? So it's always better to get up front about it.
Yeah, and can I add to that? Because I have seen a couple of these situations. It's easier for me to say it because I don't have to say the company that I helped. I have seen these issues come up kind of mid procurement. And I would say not only should you tell the government because it's like just the right thing to do, you know, there might be ways to fix the problem at that point that might become more difficult later on. Like I've been involved in a situation where it was mid procurement and people realized that there was a post government employment issue, but had to deal with, access that this person had when they were in the government. And the agency was able to mitigate that by simply disclosing that information to everyone. So, I mean, at that point, it wasn't like a competitor's proprietary information that you had to worry about disclosing, but it was internal government information that we convinced the government they could just let everybody else know. And now all of a sudden everybody's on the same page. So yeah, I can't guarantee that that will always work or that the government will always be amenable to that. But, I think we were in a much better position to present that solution mid-procurement than we would have been had we, gotten the award and then faced a protest and then had to deal with this, on the back end. So I think that not only is it the right thing to do, but I think that there are some proactive measures that you might be able to take that would be difficult if you just sit on that information.
I think Amy highlights, and I just think this whole thing, if I was listening to this as a company, or somebody thinking leaving government, if we had to take the big themes away, it is not better to ask forgiveness than permission, which is a lesson I frequently tell my class when I'm talking about conflicts of interest. You got to get that stuff up front. And the other one is the real benefit associated with proactive disclosure. Part of it is being able to address it earlier before it becomes more problematic, as Amy was just saying. But part of it's also being able to control the narrative, right? So you have, particularly we're dealing with DII, so we're dealing with a heavily regulated industry. And whereas a purely commercial company may have a instance of misconduct that they may not feel jazzed about going to DOJ with, because it's an FCPA issue or an export control, whatever it is. Once you're in a heavily regulated industry, I guess I shouldn't have said export control because that is quite heavily regulated. But being able to go to the agency and explain something or being able to address these things up front, oftentimes has a much better payoff for companies to do it. It's also a good reminder of why large companies like those being represented today are so much better situated than the smaller, even sometimes the kind of mid-tier companies that haven't invested in compliance programs, that can't pivot quite as quickly, who don't have the Tanyas with their checklists and internal information to supplement, or the Yoras, or don't have Amy to give this guidance. And it's a benefit. And I'm sorry, I'm just going to give you the shout out, the DAI toolkit, which I understand is being revamped for the small companies, but why they have so much more challenges in these things where they come from maybe a more commercial marketplace where it's totally normal to do some of these things and to get that competitive advantage. And why you also see statistically they're going to have so much more difficulty on the back end dealing with these issues.
I've also found in like the situations where we have had to go to the government and come up, explain something that has happened, the CO has been very appreciative. Like we've gotten feedback back, thank you so much for your honesty. And I think part of our role in being government contractors is to have that level of trust, right? Microsoft, one of our mottos is Microsoft runs on trust. You can lose trust so quickly. And so I think it's very important for our government agencies to know that, we're a trusted company, and we're going to be honest with you about situations that arise along the course of our procurements.
And Tanya, I know Jessica was right before you spoke, she was talking about, your checklists and kind of your systems and the U's and the Euras. So what kind of, like, it's a complex framework, right? Everyone here has some kind of level of involvement with it, but how do you turn that into like an operational system? And, what kind of centralized tracking do you do, if you don't mind kind of sharing? I understand you have a kind of tool that you're using at this point. So if you could walk us through that.
Right. So, we have our compliance team has a compliance corner where we have a variety of one pages where we pages on a variety of topics. And this is one of it because, sometimes people are like, why do I have to do this? I don't have time to waste explaining to it. So I just refer them to that resource. It explains the whole reason, the background, the history, going back hundreds of years, why we do this. But I will say also within our team, the age of AI is here, and, this has been a very busy year. And so we've gotten a lot of these reviews, a lot's going on. And so, we've had to outsource this portion of our reviews to outside counsel. And as of recently, Copilot, Microsoft Copilot, I'm going to put a pitch there. Microsoft Copilot, has agents. And I will say about a year ago, I tried to create an agent to do something similar. It was an epic fail. But things have changed over the last year. And I tried again, probably about a month or so ago. And because the rules for this particular requirement are very distinct, I can just highlight them, put them in there. I'm able to upload the ethics letter, the resume, the job description, everything, and ask it to do an initial review. And it is actually done very well. I've gone back to some of the ones where we've actually identified restrictions and run it through to see would it catch all of them, and it's doing a very good job of it. So I think it doesn't eliminate my need to review the resume and to look through it, but it at least does that initial draft, saving me a lot of time in typing everything up. Crazy, right? And so, and I think sometimes we find with these is that people have their response and then they just go in and change names and try to change stuff. And then you miss something and so-and-so's name is wrong. And so having a tool that just does it a de novo letter using a template that I've told it to follow has been very helpful. And we're hoping that maybe in the next year or so, we're sort of doing a little pilot now to see how effective it is, to see if maybe we can maybe eliminate that cost and be able to spend that money we spend on outside counsel elsewhere within our program.
By the way, I was going to say, any outside counsel listening to this are now horrified. So
sorry.
We'll still have stuff to do. I'm not worried.
You are anything at HII that kind of rings true for you on that?
We haven't been as sophisticated as Tanya using AI as a tool, but that's fascinating. And I might talk to Tanya off grid about this a little bit more to just get some more feedback about her experience. But when you are in that situation, I think the tools, we don't necessarily have any tools, so it's still a very manual process. And like Tanya said, even with any kind of AI assist, you end up having to review it just to make sure, right? I mean, you hear so much about these stories of AI, what do they call, hallucinations or something like that, right? I don't, present myself as an AI expert or anything like that, but it's really about, I think, just re-emphasizing some of the earlier kind of themes that we talked about was education training, pushing down the ethics point of this and compliance point of it from the top down, making sure all of your managers are aware of what's going on, and just kind of incorporating the review as part of your recruitment process. I come from a labor and employment background, so I kind of think of this as a recruitment issue, but I know like Tanya and Amy talk about it from the government contracts issue. But, I think it's got these revolving door and post-government restriction issues kind of has its legs in multiple different areas.
One thing I would just to respond briefly, and I also noticed, Tanya, if you haven't seen, there's a question in the chat for you. the one thing I would mention about that is you just put your finger on, look at the way that Tanya is using AI to really help as an assistant, right? Summarize things that might be more efficient or more effective through AI, but also that doesn't eliminate the need for human review. And that's going to be really critical, is that if you are going to start using these tools in that way, making sure that you're maintaining protocols and policies so that you don't just have employees randomly dumping things into AI and then just considering that because they could hallucinate it or it could be biased, especially when you're dealing with employment folks. As you all know, AI becomes really dicey in terms of bias, which we all know is there. The other piece, if it goes like, let's do the basic stuff to help Tanya, whose portfolio must be huge, free up her time, and also then focus then on the stuff that requires Amy to come in and provide more outside counsel on the harder issues that AI can't to help you resolve. So it really does. I think you'll start to see over the next few years as people experiment. One is, as long as they're doing it responsibly, it gives you those buckets in terms of low level, medium level stuff that we just need to make sure we're maintaining oversight. And then what goes to Amy, what stays in house that needs to be resolved, but also being very careful with your employees when you're using those tools so that you don't have people dumping employment information out there, and you're catching those kind of known limitations like bias and hallucinations and drift, among others.
And I do see Christina's question on this, and it is true, like keeping stuff within your network. So, it all depends on how your network is set up. And if I am referencing documents and it's within my, what we call my mesh data that only I have access to, as long as I haven't shared that with other people, it just stays within my instance, right? And so it is very well protected. And as Jessica said, like, it isn't a tool that I would pass out to others, right? It's like a personal self-help tool. This isn't like a situation where, I'm going to outsource these reviews to my agent and I'm no longer going to be part of the process. It's a self-help tool for me to save time, because yes, I have a lot on my plate and I would like to look at some more of the strategic items and not spend time, typing for hours when I don't have to.
Yeah, I'm not sure everyone can actually see the question. So what came in was, when you're uploading a candidate's ethics letter or, any other type of information in this realm, does the information stay within your network? So that's what Tanya just kind of answered. I'm not sure all the attendees could see that, but that was kind of a good explanation of what works for you. But, other organizations might not want to use AI, but you come up with some system to make your life a little bit easier. Right. So a lot of what we've been talking about has been, okay, we get the candidate in the seat, and maybe they're working in the solicitation, maybe something goes wrong. We've talked through some of those issues, but I'll open this up to everybody. Kind of what happens when these employees get a new job, or, they move within the company. They either get a new title and a new role, or maybe they just start working on a project of a certain sensitive nature that maybe they weren't working on before. Like, how do you track that? And, these continuing obligations, because, maybe they worked on something in the government, they got hired and nothing was triggered, but maybe this new project or this new role does trigger. So if anyone has any thoughts on that one.
I mean, I can start, and it was a leading question. I think the answer is you do still have those ethical obligations when you move around in a company. And I think, sure, you can have protocols in terms of, having, maybe you change roles and it is standard procedure for you to essentially go through the application process for that role. And so then you're back in the recruiting process and certain things get triggered again. But accepting that maybe not every company is going to do things that way. I think this is where training and awareness becomes really, really important, because at the end of the day, I think it can just be very difficult to be tracking these issues for every employee once they're in the door, throughout the entirety of their careers, when, depending on how long some of these restrictions are. So yes, you can have protocols in place, but I think one of the best defenses here is just making sure that your employees understand these restrictions, understand why they're in place, understand what the implications can be if they're violated, so that they themselves are aware and can identify when they have moved roles and understand that when they move roles, that these ethical implications might come back up again. So, I mean, I'm certainly curious from our in-house folks, you know, what processes they might have or recommendations they might have. But I think kind of like the training and the culture plays a big part here. Once employees are through the door, they've gone through that first level, but then there are ethical restrictions that are going to continue and might be implicated as they change roles within the company, or even jobs or tasks within the company.
No, I agree. You know, if they go through the recruiting process again because they're applying for a new role, they'll be snagged through that process. I think part of our process is to share a portion of the analysis, the post-government analysis with the candidate after we do their initial one. And part of it is to telling them, part of it is, and if you change roles and you go and you're doing something again that might be implemented, you need to raise the issues so that we can do a review again. And we do compliance topics of the month. So at least once a year, we're focusing on this particular topic, and it goes out to thousands of people. And I think the training is it's really on the obligation at that point of the candidate, especially if they're not applying for a new role, to be able to raise the flag and note that a review needs to be accomplished again or completed again.
Yeah, we actually discovered this was a process issue during our internal transfers. You know, if they were being transferred pursuant to a requisition, you have the traps in place in order to vet this issue. But if there wasn't, for whatever reason, there wasn't a requisition, we might not go through the recruiting process. But really, what we've done to remedy this is put in a self-disclosure requirement for the individual, because he or she should, like Tanya said, understand what those restrictions are, know that they might carry forward, and to make sure that it at least triggers another review to see if, let's say a 2-year representation ban, it's expired by now. If there's a lifetime ban, you want to make sure that's still in place and what needs to be done to make sure we comply with those.
It's a lot of front end work. So that is a good point where we can say, okay, we've trained a kind of people, we've brought them on board now, we've done everything we can to mitigate these issues, and we've trained them. And I know that we've covered a lot of ground. I see, at our time point here. If you do have any questions at this point, please feel free to put that in the chat. I have one more for the group here. And I'll probably start with Jessica. So how should companies interpret behind the scenes assistance, especially, for former government employees when they're talking about strategy and stuff but they have one of those bans in place. So what's kind of some best practices in that area?
Well, I mean, I think you're seeing it right now, right? So the best practice is to have a policy in place, but don't let that policy sit on a shelf and collect dust, but to actually implement it and make it a living and breathing thing that adapts, customize it to the company and its own compliance challenges. I think you see different things here. It sounds to me right now that some companies are having challenges, and I see where we're approaching on the 7 minutes remaining. So I will also make a side issue that Sarah didn't ask. You're welcome, Sarah. But I think you've heard today the variety of things. When in a resource constrained environment, you're turning to emerging tech, which I think can be done if it's done responsibly. And in the Q&A, I actually put a suggestion for how you might want to do that and approach it, which is high level guidance. But I mean, I think any company experimenting with these things needs to make sure they're doing responsibly, especially in the hiring area. Please, especially in the hiring area. But I think the bigger thing that if I had to take a takeaway from everything today, beyond kind of the bigger themes that we've discussed, and having a policy and having a compliance program and training people and working with people and tone at the top and all that kind of stuff we've said, is like what I find so remarkable about the post-employment, not conflicts of interest, which I consider completely, they're often done in the same bucket, but I view them as very distinct risks in terms of what I consider ethics issues. The post-employment to me is so wonky in the United States because, and this is nothing, and this is my personal opinion, this is not their opinion. Like we recognize that there are risks and protests scoop up a lot of them, right? If we see somebody using non-public or confidential information that's competitively useful, that provides them with an unfair competitive advantage, yes, of course, that's problematic. If we see somebody trying to access information they had at their time in government and use it improperly and exploit it, if we see people exploiting their access, if we see people switching sides on a same matter, like there are things that I think many of us could agree are objectively problematic and unfair. But there are so many other things where you basically sit somebody in an unrelated division for a year, then suddenly magically poof, after the clock expires, there's no more bad stuff that can happen anymore. It seems really weird and problematic. And it also becomes really difficult where it penalizes people for having the audacity to engage in public service because they think they're going to be put in a prison or a no-no corner for a year or 2 years or whatever your ban is. And I think the US and I think other governments too, no one's found that secret sauce to dealing with this effectively. I think protests are one of the most effective. We could do it a lot better and a lot more effectively where we're genuinely getting at the worst behaviors. And then Tanya and Yura don't have to be stuck, maintaining all these things to make sure there are years. And I'm not mocking what you're doing. You're trying to comply with the current system. But when I hear people saying, well, it should be 5 years or 10 years, it makes my brain want to explode that we shouldn't penalize people, make it impossible for them to ever leave the government or frankly to ever want to join the government because stuff is so onerous on the back end. And I feel like as a country, we could be doing it so much better. Let's go after the worst stuff and then find a way to like truly make it a much more manageable system. So I'm sorry you didn't ask, but I had to come up with that rant because that's just like, what are we doing here, folks? All right. I'll stop
I
talking.
promised the rant time. Honestly, that's on me because I said I blocked Jessica rant time. So, that's on me. So we do have one question that came in. I think this is what we'll have time for. So it's from an agency ethics counselor. So, here we go. And they are asking, looking to improve the quality of the letters. Okay, probably due to this webinar. So we're already having an impact. The form that is used only asks a small list of questions about government service. So like the garbage in, right? Like maybe the form that's actually people are filling out might be part of the problem. Are there any specific questions you wish that these ethics counselors asked or spent more time analyzing to ensure a candidate is armed with the best ethics letter possible? I open the floor.
I can share my list. I don't mind sharing my list of questions. It'd be nice if they were answered so I didn't have to constantly ask for them. But I can share that.
What's
And
kind of the top?
I think the key also, to Jessica's rant, which I appreciate, I do make it very clear, we're not here to keep people from coming to work at our company. At no time is the review to keep somebody from coming here to work. It's to make sure that they're able to work here in a way that doesn't get the company in trouble.
Yeah, and I hope it was clear that my rant was not aimed at the companies. It's
no, I know.
at the rules themselves, which are just not great.
Yeah, but I do think sometimes when I present that we have to do this review, people feel like I'm trying to keep them from hiring people. And I'm not trying to do that at all. I'm just trying to make sure that those people can do their best here when they come here to work and not cause problems. Nobody wants to be that guy.
And then also you're demonstrating again that it turns your compliance officer who's only trying to keep the company compliant into the bad guy, which you never want your compliance function to be. And that it's so disheartening. So thank you for saying that, because I think it reminds people, like, again, what are we doing here?
So I just wanted to add on to answer that question, what more could you analyze in the ethics letters? Even for the most seasoned outside counsel where we've had this issue arise, defining the particular matter that may be at issue. If you get enough information as the ethics counselor that's preparing this letter, I think it'd be really helpful to kind of analyze that issue with a little bit more specificity. Because quite frankly, the ethics letters I've seen, they go through the statutory and regulatory definitions of what a particular matter might be, but then give a very vague conclusion without going through any specifics. So I have to consult with my program people and do a much deeper dive in order to understand what this particular matter is. And again, it's just about having, I think it was someone said at the beginning, these ethics letters are not a get out of jail free card, right? But it would be helpful to have the ethics perspective on it, the ethics counselor's perspective on it, just because there's not a lot of case law, and you go scouring through the internet in terms of what available guidance there might be in terms of what some of these terms may mean. And they're not the easiest to define in some cases. So
That's great. And thank you so much. That's why, some of us work in this space. It keeps every day exciting and fresh. So I think we'll end it there. I know we're right on time. So thank you so much to our panelists taking all the time preparing for this and giving all those really valuable insights. And thank you everybody for tuning in. And if anyone wants to visit dii.org, we can always reach out with some questions that way as well. So thank you again to everybody, and have a wonderful rest of your week.